I want to start with a document. 1848. That is the year the newly founded Smithsonian Institution published its very first book, Volume 1. It wasn't about astronomy or biology or the founding of the nation. It was a massive, highly detailed survey titled Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. They documented what they found across the American Midwest. And what they found, they'll say if you read the official summaries today, were simple earthen mounds, ritual sites built by indigenous hunter-gatherer societies over thousands of years. And for most of my life, I accepted that. I didn't question it. Why would I? It's on the historical markers by the side of the highway. It's the kind of fact you absorb on a school field trip the same way you absorb everything else, passively, without resistance, without asking the math. But then I started looking at the sheer physical volume of the dirt. And once I did, the official story collapsed. Before we go any further, I need to briefly return to something I covered in the previous videos in this series. And if you haven't seen them, I'll link them below, because what follows won't carry its full weight without that foundation. In those episodes, we explored the sudden, unexplained disappearance of old-world architectural knowledge. The 42-ton monoliths, the 12-foot doors, the impossible joinery that vanished from the human record in the mid-19th century. We looked at the concept of a knowledge extinction event, a period where a sophisticated, pre-industrial civilization was quieted, and its physical remnants were either repurposed, buried, or destroyed to make way for the modern, a linear narrative of human progress. We looked at stone. Today, we are looking at earth, because here is what the official account of the American mounds glosses over: the staggering continental scale of the construction. We are not talking about a few dozen dirt hills. Before the 1850s, before the aggressive expansion of American agriculture and the plow, there were an estimated 100,000 earthworks across the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. Some were perfect, geometric circles covering 50 acres. Some were octagons aligned to the 18.6-year lunar cycle with a precision that requires advanced observational astronomy and complex trigonometry. Cahokia's Monk's Mound, near modern-day St. Louis, has a larger footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It contains 22 million cubic feet of earth that was carefully selected, layered, and then engineered to prevent internal collapse or water erosion over centuries. The official explanation is that this was done with woven baskets and stone hose. The explanation is tidy, the timeline is clean, but then I started pulling on threads that didn't belong to that story, because the real anomaly isn't just the dirt, it's what was inside it. If you go back to the original source material, not the modern interpretations, but the actual county histories, the local newspaper archives, and the field notes of town doctors and early antiquarians from the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, a pattern emerges that is so consistent and so bizarre that it demands an explanation. As settlers expanded westward, they leveled thousands of these mounds to build farms and lay railroad tracks, and as they dug, they found graves. But the skeletons inside were not normal. The New York Times, the Scientific American, local gazettes from Ohio to Wisconsin to Iowa, they didn't just report one or two anomalies. They reported dozens, hundreds, accounts of skeletons measuring 7 feet, 8 feet, sometimes 9 feet in length, skulls with massive, heavy jaws, femurs that reached a normal man's waist, double rows of teeth. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that 19th century newspapers never exaggerated. Yellow journalism was real. Hoaxes were real. People made things up to sell papers. I understand all of that, but I want to ask a different kind of question. Not whether every single report was flawless, but why this specific anatomical anomaly? Why the exact same description? Massive height, abnormal cranial structure. Some heavily calcified bones, reported by independent doctors, farmers, and local officials across dozens of unconnected towns over a 40-year period. If you are inventing a hoax to sell a local newspaper in 1870, you invent a monster. You invent buried Spanish gold. You don't invent a 7.5-foot skeleton with specific anatomical variations that match reports from a town 500 miles away that you've never visited. You don't guess that. You document it. You report what you are physically looking at in the dirt. And for a brief window in the mid-19th century, before the institutional narrative solidified, these discoveries were public knowledge. Even Abraham Lincoln, in an 1848 speech at Niagara Falls, casually referenced it. He said, and I quote, "The eyes of that species of extinct giants, whose bones fill the mounds of America, it have gazed on Niagara, as ours do now." He didn't say it as a fringe theory. He said it as an accepted fact of the landscape. If you're finding this worth your time, and I hope you are, consider subscribing or becoming a YouTube member. This series goes places that most channels won't touch, and having you along for it means everything. Now, back to the mounds, because this is where the timeline gets disturbing. I want to return to the Smithsonian Institution because I think we've been looking at their role from the wrong angle. In 1881, the Smithsonian created the Bureau of Ethnology, directed by Major John Wesley Powell. Powell was a brilliant man, a logistical genius, but he was also a man with a very specific ideology. He believed in a strictly linear progression of human evolution, from savagery to barbarism to civilization. Yet to Powell, the idea that an advanced lost race, let alone a physically different giant race, had built monumental geometry in America before the Native Americans was not just incorrect. It was institutionally dangerous. It threatened the entire academic framework of the 19th century. So Powell issued a mandate. The Bureau of Ethnology was given massive federal funding to aggressively excavate the remaining mounds. Their stated goal was scientific cataloging, and maybe that's all it was. But here's the part that makes the timing impossible to set aside. Whenever a local newspaper reported the unearthing of an anomalous skeleton, a 7-footer in a slate vault in Ohio, a massive skull in a Wisconsin mound, the pattern was almost always the same. Within weeks, agents from the Smithsonian would arrive. They would take possession of the bones for further study. They would pack them into wooden crates, load them onto trains heading east to Washington, D.C., and then silence. Silence. Not a delay in publication. Not a temporary misplacement in a cataloging room. Complete, institutional, multi-generational silence. The crates went in, and the contents never came out. In 1894, the Bureau of Ethnology published its massive, definitive 12th annual report on the mound explorations. It was authored by Cyrus Thomas, and it became the foundational text for all modern American archaeology. Its conclusion was absolute. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the historic Native American tribes. No lost races, no ancient, advanced civilizations, and certainly no giants. The report was thorough. It was authoritative. It was the final word. But if you read that report, and I mean really read it, tracing the index against the earlier field notes of the men who actually dug the trenches, you realize what the report is. It is not a comprehensive summary of what was found. It is a filter. The 7-foot skeletons with heavy mandibles? Omitted. The anatomically anomalous skulls that local doctors had measured and documented before handing them over to federal agents. Dismissed as misidentifications, or simply left out of the text entirely. Now, I want to talk about what we're not allowed to do, because this is the part of the giant conversation that most people skip past, and I think it's the most important part. You cannot go to the Smithsonian today and ask to see the remains from the 19th century Ohio mound excavations. I want to be precise about this. Set to the casual response is, of course you can't. Human remains are protected now by repatriation laws. And yes, they are, as they should be under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. But I'm not talking about 1990. I'm talking about 1890, 1920, 1950, decades where museums proudly displayed mummies, indigenous remains, and anatomical anomalies in glass cases for the public. The Smithsonian displayed everything. But they did not display the anomalous giant skeletons from the mounds. The result is that the physical evidence, the very bones that would either confirm or definitively debunk the thousands of local newspaper reports, is functionally inaccessible. And I want to ask, why does that feel normal to us? Yet we accept that a newly founded federal institution in the 19th century systematically collected the most controversial archaeological artifacts in North America, locked them away, excluded them from the official published reports, and we simply nod along. We accept that it was just bad 19th century record-keeping. We accept that thousands of farmers, doctors, and town mayors all simultaneously hallucinated the size of the bones they held in their hands. The coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore the longer you sit with it. Let me tell you about the architecture problem, because this is where the Tartaria connection stops being abstract. Across this series, we've documented the presence of old-world construction techniques, structures that appear fully complete, massive stone buildings with impossible tolerances. Yet the mounds are the earthen equivalent of that same impossible geometry. The Newark earthworks in Ohio originally covered 3,000 acres. The octagon there is so perfectly laid out that you can fit 4 Roman colosseums inside it. Its vertices align with the northernmost and southernmost moonrises, a cycle that takes 18.6 years to complete. To build that, you do not just need dirt. You need a centralized civilization with generational record-keeping, advanced surveying mathematics, and a standardized unit of measurement. And researchers who have analyzed the geometry of the Ohio mounds have found something staggering. The builders used a standard unit of measurement, roughly 18.5 feet. It appears over and over again in the diameters of the circles and the lengths of the squares. It is a mathematical fingerprint, and it is not isolated. And that same underlying mathematical logic, the same geometric obsession, echoes the precision we see in the stone star forts of Europe, the massive polygonal masonry of South America, and the unexplainable classical architecture sitting on muddy streets in 19th century America. The transition periods are missing. The documentation is thin. The timelines don't work. Something was already there. Something was built by someone who came before. And just like the magnificent cast-iron facades and 42-ton granite columns of the 1850s that were quickly demolished and replaced by cheap industrial brick, the mounds suffered the exact same fate at the exact same time. Between 1850 and 1900, the same 50-year window where we lost the tacit knowledge of master masonry, we also physically erased the ancient earthworks. Cities were built directly on top of them. Railroads plowed through them. The clay was harvested to make bricks. St. Louis was once known as Mound City because it contained dozens of massive earthen pyramids. Today, exactly one survives. The rest were leveled, destroyed, erased. The silence, when you start listening for it, is everywhere in this story. No serious mainstream academic discussion of the anomalous, skeletal measurements recorded by 19th century doctors. No institutional curiosity about the missing Smithsonian shipping crates. No explanation for how hunter-gatherers engineered 3,000-acre lunar observatories with a standardized measuring system. The silence isn't accidental. Silence on this scale, across this many disciplines, maintained for this long. That's not an absence of evidence. That's a shape. And that shape suggests something. I'm not going to tell you what it suggests. I think you already feel it. I want to close with something that has been sitting with me since I first started pulling this thread. If we accept provisionally, carefully, with all appropriate skepticism, that before the current paradigm, North America was home to a civilization capable of continental-scale geometric earthworks. If we accept that the builders of these monuments possessed physical characteristics, height, bone density, cranial capacity, that fundamentally break the linear evolutionary model, and if we accept that the institutions founded in the mid-19th century made a deliberate, systematic choice to collect the physical evidence of that civilization and quietly remove it from the public record, then we have to ask the hardest question. What were they protecting? Not from us, necessarily, maybe from chaos, maybe from the total collapse of the academic and historical framework that justified the westward expansion of the 19th century. If the land you are conquering isn't a pristine wilderness, but the graveyard of a highly advanced, giant race that was wiped out by a cataclysm, that changes the story. That changes everything. What knowledge was buried in those mounds? What history was loaded onto federal trains and driven into the dark archives of Washington, D.C., never to be seen again? I don't have the answer. I want to be honest with you about that. I have been sitting with these questions for months, and they have not resolved. They have only deepened. The further I go into the record, the more I find not answers, but structure, as the shape of something deliberately obscured, something whose outlines I can trace without being able to see its face. Once you see that structure, you cannot unfocus your eyes from it. An advanced mathematical civilization operating across the Americas. Skeletons that defy modern biology, documented by thousands, and then quietly vanished by the very institution created to study them. A physical landscape of pyramids and geometry bulldozed into oblivion within a single generation. Maybe it was just bad record-keeping. Maybe it was just 19th century sensationalism. Or maybe, buried somewhere under the ice of Antarctica, or locked in the basement of the Smithsonian, is the missing chapter of the human story. I can't stop thinking about the empty crates, and I don't think you will either. Outro music swells. Now, if this series is worth something to you, consider commenting your thoughts or your theories below. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. We are going to look at the world's fairs, the disposable cities. I think I am ready now. See you there.